This is a long one today, and one of our speakers has to leave right at 3 p.m., so we really want to get the most out of this. If you could take a seat, please. If you could take a seat, please. If you're standing, or if I'm talking about you, answer is yes. So if you're standing and I'm saying, can you take a seat, please? That's who I'm talking to. For example, Ben, whose name I'm going to name, Ben Wilson, who's in the column, talking about me. Ben, we're going to get started. Yeah, you're still standing there. So the next panel I'm really excited about. Last year, the MMT conference, we were talking about monetary theory after MMT, not in the sense of because MMT is obsolete, but what does it mean for the broader world of understanding money and monetary theory now that MMT is firmly arrived and not going anywhere. One of the things that Laura Yule was on that panel said is hopefully that the future of these discussions will have people in that look a little bit more like her and a little bit less like me. I'm thrilled that this panel and the topics it's addressing are a start of trying to integrate those considerations more directly. Money has clearly had a long history of its relationship to race and civil rights, and we've got some of the best thinkers and activists out there on those topics on this panel. Without any further ado, I'll hand over to the moderator for this talk, my good friend Malaika, who is an attorney and writer based in New York City. Malaika, welcome, take it away.
My name is Malaika Jabali, and as you know, we're here to discuss money, race, and civil rights. Theoretically, we should all be enjoying a web of civil rights, from voting rights to public education to housing rights. But as we know, we also have an entrenched system of white supremacy that prevents those rights from being conferred equally. We can view modern monetary theory as a way to address how we equalize people's access to rights in this country. So each panelist will speak about their work for up to 15 minutes. We've got some fancy PowerPoints up here for y'all. I'll ask some questions about these intersections of money, race, and civil rights, and then we'll spend about 30 minutes on audience questions. So with that, we're going to let you know who everyone is. We have Nina Banks, who is to your far right. She's Associate Professor of Economics at Bucknell University. She serves on the Board of Directors of the National Economic Association and the Economic Policy Institute. Professor Banks is currently working on 2 books on Sadie Alexander, a biography and an edited volume of her speeches and writings. To her right is Shawn Sebastian. He's the Iowa Organizing Director of the Working Families Party and Movement Politics Organizer for Iowa Citizens for Community Improvement. Shawn was the director of the Fed Up campaign at the Center of Popular Democracy, organizing working class people of color to demand full employment monetary policy at the Federal Reserve. He completed law school at NYU and was a lecturer in law at Columbia Law School, teaching law and organizing for social change. Camille Walsh is an associate professor of law, economics, and public policy and American and ethnic studies at the University of Washington, Bothell. She holds a JD and a PhD in 20th century U.S. history, and her first book, Racial Taxation, School Segregation, and Taxpayer Citizenship from 1869 to 1873, was published in 2018 by University of North Carolina Press. And then we have Delman Coates, is the senior pastor of Mount Enon Baptist Church in Clinton, Maryland, and the organizer of the Our Money campaign. He is active in social justice advocacy. Okay, y'all can clap it up. He is active in social justice advocacy through service on the board of the National Action Network, the NAACP Image Awards Committee, and as board chair of the Black Church Center for Justice and Equality. Reverend Coates is a graduate of Morehouse College, Harvard Divinity School, and Columbia University. Now, I'll leave it to our esteemed panelists. Could you start from our left to the right?
I think we start with Camille.
For the PowerPoint? Okay.
Thank you, and thank you to organizers and Malaika for that introduction.
I'm thrilled to be here, and I think it's probably best that I go first so that you don't have to look at this picture of Klans people for any longer than you need to. Grab this. So I come to MMT sort of sideways. As Marcus said, I'm a historian, lawyer by training, but certainly was not that aware of MMT when I was doing research on my book, and then somehow still ended up at a very MMT conclusion in the end. So let's just dive in. If you look a little closer at this picture, this is of course a protest against desegregation. This was in Tennessee, I believe, Judson County. And you can see on the sign it says, "We pay our taxes, why can't we have our rights?" So we'll talk a little bit today about the origins and the uses that this language of taxpayer identity and a sort of poisonous discourse of taxpayer solidarity has been put to, uses it's been put to over the decades. So I do want to start with also a incident that happened just yesterday. I don't know if you noticed this. A friend of mine sent it to me online. A former ICE director, Thomas Hohn, in response to Representative Camille Walsh, a woman of color, my representative from Seattle. She was telling him his time was up, and his response was to sort of lose his temper and shout at her, "I'm a taxpayer, you work for me." Just very affronted by this. So we see this discourse everywhere. It is sort of my permanent trigger word, taxpayer. So this is my book, Racial Taxation, which came out last year, and the two key questions I look at in this book are who gets to call themselves a taxpayer and in what conditions. And this is relevant in part because, of course, if we look deeply into, or even shallowly, really, into tax paying and the practice of tax paying, then everyone is, right? Unless they're an infant, maybe, right? But if it means everyone, then clearly it's being used to mean something else entirely. It's not being used to just say, oh, I paid sales tax on that soda, or I had some payroll tax deducted from my paychecks last year. It means something else. So that's one question. Another question is what the relationship is between racial inequality and claims of taxpayer rights. So I argue in the book that taxpayer language has been used as an alibi for inequality, particularly racial inequality in U.S. history. And it's a coded language of whiteness. So it's a way of saying, I accrue the privilege of whiteness or white identity or sort of middle class identity without having to use those words. It's just a code. All right. So this racial consciousness has been deployed by actually people on all sides of many debates. And this is where I think it gets really insidious. Nathan and I were just discussing this. So you can see it coming from people who are, like the Klansmen defending segregation with their last gasp. And they have a very private, individual, white supremacist rooted notion of what it means to be a taxpayer. But you also see it used for very dignitarian, communitarian kind of claims, right? You see it in arguments from people who are saying, hey, we're protesting segregation because we are responsible tax-paying citizens, and so we deserve our rights. So the little poison pill buried in there is still there, right? The idea that you deserve your rights if you're judged to have paid some particular amount of taxes that someone somewhere might deem enough or sufficient, which of course it never is, right? Because that's not really what the word taxpayer means. But it's still there on whatever side it's being deployed. And then we also see racial taxation in property tax funding as an integral foundation for both unequal schools and for educational segregation. So I've been thinking a lot in the last few days, of course, about how MMT and the sort of theories of MMT really around taxing and spending are linked to some of the things that I found in my historical research. And I think obviously one of the clear ones is that MMT really uncovers and exposes the way it's politics rather than sort of some fundamental characteristic of currency that links taxing and spending. So it's a political choice always to communicate the idea or to entrench the idea that your taxes are what are paying for something. And it's also then a choice, as Lua was saying yesterday, to fund or not fund particular things. It's not that we're constrained by these lack of funds, it's that we're choosing not to fund something, we're choosing it very intentionally. And I also want to highlight this third point, that taxpayer is just not a fundamentally useful, this is very historian language, it's not a particularly useful form of solidarity. I would say it's really a poisonous form of solidarity. It's really dangerous. And I have colleagues in tax history that I value and respect greatly who would disagree with me on this because they have seen examples, and there are definitely examples of folks arguing for civil rights, arguing for LGBTQ rights, saying like, we're taxpayers, don't we have the right to X, Y, or Z thing, like give us our equal rights. Totally understandable, and I find many of those examples in research for my book. But I think there's always a population being left out, and there's always the implication that you can somehow achieve the sort of whiteness and middle classness that taxpayer status implies if you just say the word enough. And of course you never will. You're never really going to be in that club because the club was designed to keep you out. So in reference to the discussion of government cheese yesterday, I grew up on food stamps, welfare, government cheese, first in family going to college. My mom was homeless intermittently. So when I first read Marx in college, I was like, oh, I'm a lumpen proletariat. I'm not more like dignified proletariat, dignified working class. Like, my family does not count as taxpayers. We would not qualify in the sort of logic of if you pay taxes, then you get personhood, right? You get personhood because you're a person. You don't have to do anything else. So I think the other piece that's really missing from these taxpayer arguments is historicity, and this is also where it really links to MMT. Because the fact that, you know, if you're talking about a public school, I find all these letters from people who are like, I moved to this wealthy school district so that my kids could go to the school, and I paid for the school. And of course, the school was built 50 years ago, right? Like, they moved here last year. The school was built a long time ago with other funds completely, and it really has nothing to do with you. But if you think about it in terms of that historicity, then you do decouple taxing and spending, and politically, that's actually not ideal for a lot of people in power, right? They want to keep people thinking that taxing and spending are linked, and they particularly want to keep them thinking that their tax dollars are something that they should hoard, or that they should sort of focus on as their privilege and their right. So educational finance and property tax systems are part of what I look at, a big part of what I look at in the book, because they are the specific way that in the US school funds have been distributed. And this is what is also like a little tricky area, I think, for MMT, at least again, as a very new person to this field, because these are state and local governments, right? Even today, the federal government only contributes about 8% of the funding to public education, K-12 education across the country. And that's because the system that created these local property tax finance systems has been in place since the Civil War, and even a little bit before. I don't think that's an accident, right? It's been there since the Civil War, and it's spread from many states in the South to states in the North as a way of sort of consolidating and hoarding what Michael Tomas calls white hoarding or white accumulation. It hoards those resources and then contests anyone's claim in the community to an equal share of resources, an equal share of infrastructure, an equal share of education or other rights. It's also really important to think about the fact that these funding structures have been in place in the same way since the 19th century because segregated schools were intertwined with them. So it's not that segregated schools happened over here and property tax funding happened over here. They were intertwined from the start. They were part and parcel of each other. And so if the funding structure really hasn't changed, right, our federal tax structure has changed radically in this time period. Local property tax structure for public education has not. So if that hasn't changed, why would we ever expect school segregation to have really fundamentally changed, which it also has not, right? Those two things are too closely linked. And it's also tied to, again, like I said, the MMT component here that I think is interesting is federalism. Because these state and local systems are the place where the bulk of the funds are being sort of given to and then redistributed through the tax expense system at the state level, they then create this really tight linkage in people's minds around the political identity as a taxpayer. That you check off a box to vote for a school levy, and I'm not saying everybody should vote for school levies, but you're checking off that box and it's creating a sense of entitlement, like, I'm paying for this levy, I'm a homeowner, I'm a property owner, I pay my property taxes, and so I'm entitled to a certain kind of school, or my child is. That entitlement is something that I think a particular political class wants and encourages, right? The belief that your taxes are that tightly linked to a particular local good. And it doesn't have to be that way. Certainly it's not that way in a lot of countries in the world. I'll talk a little bit, actually I should start to wrap up. I'll talk a little bit in a moment about one example of a federal attempt to get federal funding for school finance, or for school building. There are secession movements today, as some of you may know, that are based very much on this exact structure. They're based on the fact that residential property and taxes have been linked with school segregation from the start. Okay, so I'm going to move ahead through a couple of cases. There's a really important case, San Antonio versus Rodriguez, that some of you may know from 1973. This was the case that shut the door on the idea of education as a fundamental right. It also shut the door on the idea that poverty, the court calls it wealth, it's sort of a confusing thing, but they mean poverty, is a protected class, and they just sort of ignore the race claim entirely, which is part of what provoked me to go down this route. From law school, I went and got my PhD in part because of this case. So I'm going to move ahead a little bit. I'm happy to talk about some of the findings of the book more in Q&A. The two key historical things that I found in the archives over and over again, well, more than two, but a couple of the big ones that, this is the fun thing that historians get to do, right? We get to say, I wonder if there's anything in the past that everybody has kind of forgotten about, maybe because they don't want to talk about it, because we don't like to think about the bad things we did, or whatever else. And so you look back 100 years and you find, oh, actually, there used to be different kinds of funding systems for different schools, some of which, in this case in Mississippi, were very intentionally drawn to doubly tax Black residents, Black property owners. So, of course, lines drawn by white school boards constantly being used to actually doubly tax Black citizens. And then the irony of their claim, the segregationist claim, was that they would then say that whites paid all the taxes. And, Black people went to school, but whites were paying all the taxes. That was a really common, election trope. So again, I'm going to move ahead past some of the double taxation cases, but there was a lot of them. And then the other kind of taxation that I found when I looked back through the archives, through the court cases, is what you can think of as, it's empirically seems like the worst. They're both terrible. Turns out they're both good, right? There's no good one because they're segregated school systems. So the other kind was the separate segregated taxation. What they would do for this was make sure that white people were taxed only for white schools and Black people were taxed only for Black schools. So they literally had separate pots of money. And there's a number of cases around this because they're contesting sort of what identity a corporation has, particularly a corporation in a Black community where all the Black residents are purchasing their necessities every day and spending their money. Okay, and then the last thing I want to show you are a couple of letters, just quickly. This was on a scrap of paper about this big. The Library of Congress is a letter to the NAACP. And they just said, they burned down our school, we rebuilt it, and they burned it down again. Please help us, we are taxpaying citizens. So this is an example of what I was saying about the dignitarian, very understandable claim to identity as a taxpayer, because you are in a world where it seems that identifying as a taxpayer is maybe one of the only routes to dignity. I would say, it still didn't work. That's one of the problems with this. This is actually another of my favorite quotes of all time. but you can still see that even if somebody didn't pay taxes, they matter less, right? If they're a 5-year-old, do they somehow not count at all? If they are a homeless person who has been outside of the taxation system for a while, do they count less? And then, of course, so many white supremacist letters as taxpayers. So I'll just breeze through these, but a lot of discussion of white tax dollars, a lot of assumptions about who's paying taxes. I mean, we know that economic inequality and racial inequality are deeply tied together, but you can also see these inherent assumptions, especially in deep South states or counties where the predominant population was African American, where in fact, Black people very often were paying for white schools, but the local white residents would articulate the exact opposite. So the conclusion, I just wanted to mention the Blair Bill, because this was a moment in time in the 1880s, emerging from a couple of other bills during Reconstruction that tried to push for federal funding of education. This was a time when there really weren't widespread public schools anyway, especially in the South. And it was defeated, but it was defeated narrowly. It came close, which is always one of the heartbreaking things for me, right? It came very close. And if we ever want to decouple this taxpayer identity that's so insidious, then we would have to have some system by which people could see their education funding coming from the federal government, right? The sovereign. It doesn't work when it's rooted in local property tax structures and identities of local property owners. So I'll leave it there. Thank you so much.
Good afternoon. I'd like to thank the conference organizers for inviting me to talk about my research on Sadie Alexander. I'm sure that many of you have never heard of Sadie Alexander, even though she was one of the most accomplished and educated people in the world during her lifetime. She lived during a time when Black people had very limited opportunities for professional work, and the work that they performed was invisible to most white Americans. So I'd like to tell you a little bit about her before discussing her ideas on full employment. Sadie Tanner Moselle was born in 1898 in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, into two prominent and highly accomplished African American families. I'll show you a few pictures of her. This is the Tanner family. Her grandfather in the middle was Bishop Tanner of the AME Church, Methodist Church. This is a photograph, and I ask you not to take pictures of these because I'm getting permission from Penn to include them in my books. This is a photograph of Sadie Moselle with her mother, her sister, and her brother. Young photograph of Sadie Moselle, and my favorite when she's a more mature woman. And this is probably the one I want to use as my book cover. So we go back to that. Okay, she received her doctorate degree in economics in 1921 from the University of Pennsylvania. She was never a professional economist, however, due to racial and gender exclusion. She married Raymond Alexander in 1923, and they had 2 daughters. Sadie Alexander became a lawyer after not being able to work as an economist, and she had an impressive and important career as a lawyer and civil rights activist until she died in 1989. Julianne Malveaux is the first economist whose research brought Sadie Alexander into critical focus within the discipline. Malveaux's seminal research focused on Sadie Alexander's dissertation on Black migrants to Philadelphia and explored the implications of Alexander's exclusion from the profession. I started researching Alexander's extensive archival records about 15 years ago because I was determined to see if she had something of interest to say about economics beyond her dissertation, and if so, to write about it in order to restore Sadie Alexander to her rightful place in the canon of economic thought and history. I found, for example, that we incorrectly assume that a man, George Edmund Haynes, was the first Black American economist, when in fact Sadie Alexander was not just the first Black American woman economist, but also the first Black American economist. I also found that even though Sadie Alexander became a lawyer rather than a working economist, she spoke presciently on economic issues that are of great concern even today, including the need to combat Black poverty and marginalization through full employment policies, the scapegoating of migrant communities, the important role women play within the economy, and the necessity of minimizing income inequality. More recently, with the help of economists Andy Darity and Derek Hamilton and Aaron Friedman, the economics editor at INET, I came to realize that Alexander's 1945 arguments for full employment were likely the first arguments put forward by an American economist in support of a federal jobs guarantee. So I'm going to focus on Sadie Alexander's arguments for full employment job guarantees. Most of what I'm going to talk about comes from my attempts to decipher and analyze speeches that Sadie Alexander gave during World War II, which focus on the economic status of Black workers and their job prospects in the post-war economy. During World War II, the government achieved full employment by using direct job creation through public works programs such as the Civilian Conservation Corps and Works Progress Administration. Given the expected 40% cutback in jobs after the war ended, Sadie Alexander advocated that government continue to provide full employment through public works programs. The issue of money and economic security was a fundamental part of Sadie Alexander's call for full employment and job guarantees. As many of you know, in January 1944, in President Roosevelt's State of the Union address, he called for a second Bill of Rights to provide, quote, a new basis of security and prosperity. He believed that the transformation of the economy into an industrial economy since its founding required an expansion of citizens' rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Indeed, he stated that it was self-evident that, quote, true individual freedom cannot exist without economic security and independence. He also stated, quote, people who are hungry and out of a job are the stuff of which dictatorships are made. Sadie Alexander shared with Roosevelt the concern over economic insecurity and the danger that it posed to democratic rule in the United States. Alexander gave a speech in early 1945 at Florida A&M College that gave a more in-depth analysis of the racial implications of economic insecurity than Roosevelt's speech. Alexander was concerned with the effect that economic insecurity had on people's lives, on their quality of life, but also in giving rise to racial hostility. Alexander expressed this very eloquently with the hope that all people could enjoy the freedom from want and fear expressed in the Atlantic Charter, saying, quote, freedom from want and freedom from fear cannot be attained at home when hordes of unemployed men and women are pounding the city streets and bargaining on street corners against each other for a chance to do a day's work. I hold it the obligation of every American to remove those inequities which have crept into our national life and caused men to fear want and to fear each other, end quote. Alexander was concerned that economic insecurity would increase racial ethnic violence and that it would undermine the rule of law. In her speech, she drew on lessons from the previous World War. Economic uncertainty due to the loss of jobs following World War I, and especially perceptions of Black social mobility, fueled white anger and led to over 25 race riots in 1919, where white mobs terrorized Black men, women, and children across the country, killing hundreds of Black people and destroying Black homes, businesses, and communities. We are, of course, in the midst of the 100th anniversary of Red Summer. Indeed, Sadie Alexander believed that most global problems were tied to some form of economic deprivation, and so she believed that economic security was vital not only to enhance human well-being, but also as a foundation for the maintenance of democratic institutions. She warned that fears of economic uncertainty and hopelessness can be manipulated and channeled into scapegoating against marginalized communities. In a 1939 talk, Sadie Alexander said that, quote, dissatisfaction and discontent with the economic condition of the country have given rise to race-baiting speeches, end quote. In order to decrease economic insecurity, Alexander discussed the need for government regulations that would diminish fluctuations in the business cycle, and she discussed the need for government relief programs. And like Roosevelt, Sadie Alexander feared that economic insecurity would result in, quote, men and women who have lost hope demanding a dictator to take over the reins of government, end quote. We have, of course, seen this process unfold recently with the rise of right-wing populism in Europe and in the US with the election of Donald Trump and his ongoing racial demagoguery and disregard for democratic norms and practices. In the 1945 Florida speech, Sadie Alexander spoke to the audience about the persistence of racial discrimination and the status of Black workers as marginal workers, workers who were the last to be hired and the first to be fired when businesses were letting workers go. Even though Black workers had high levels of industrial employment during World War II, Sadie Alexander knew that they would be the first to be fired because they had less seniority in the plants and because of racial discrimination in employers' decision about which workers to fire. In addition, she believed that all workers would benefit from full employment and wanted white workers to realize the benefits from full employment instead of perceiving Black workers as rivals and threats to jobs. In the speech, she said, quote, the right to work is not a Black nor a white problem, but a human problem. The more men and women who are working, the greater is the demand for goods, and the more money is invested to build factories to produce goods to satisfy the demands of workers. Every man should be concerned that every other man is employed, for only in full employment is the individual laborer assured a job. I need not state to you that full employment for all willing and able to work is also the solution of all over national difficulties. So by her logic, all workers would benefit from full employment because it would mean having job security. The threat of unemployment erodes workers' ability to negotiate with employers over better compensation and working conditions, either as individuals or as members of unions who are engaged in collective bargaining. Alexander believed that having a fully employed labor force would increase workers' pay and purchasing power. This could not occur if whites continued to exclude Black workers from having the right to work. Sadie Alexander said that full employment was, quote, the only solution to the economic subjugation of the Negro and of the great masses of white labor. If full employment by determination of the people and the government could be obtained for the destructive purposes of the war, why can we not achieve it for the constructive purposes of maintaining the peace? Therefore, Alexander favored government taking an active role in the economy when there were shortfalls in production. She believed that the federal government should provide jobs that paid livable wages to workers who were willing and able to work, but who were unable to do so because of the failure of the private sector to create enough jobs. Alexander maintained that the right to work was a fundamental right that all citizens, in fact all humans, should have. The example of the success of direct job creation during World War II was the lesson that FDR and Sadie Alexander drew upon when they called for a fully employed labor force in the post-war period. Moreover, when Sadie Alexander talked about full employment through public works programs, She focused on public works projects that addressed urgent national problems. However, the problems that she suggested were about quality of life issues. In other words, Sadie Alexander focused on investments in people, not just investments in physical infrastructure of buildings and repairing roads and bridges, but also investments in what we would call social infrastructure, health, education, nutrition, for example. So I'm going to show you 4 slides. The first 2 slides are of economic conditions during the 1940s when Sadie Alexander advanced her program, and then the next 2 slides are of poverty conditions in rural and urban areas today. Urban poverty, 1940s. Rural poverty, 1940s. Today, rural poverty, and today, urban poverty. Alexander envisioned a public works program that addressed pressing needs that would enhance people's well-being. She called for improving housing conditions in urban slums, providing electricity to every farm, reducing illiteracy, reducing hunger, and making sure that people were properly clothed. That's typically not what we think about today when we focus on public works, and yet Sadie Alexander's vision is, I think, a more comprehensive public works or jobs program because it would create jobs in a variety of fields and also have the effect of improving the quality of people's lives in both the short and long term. And finally, as we segue into the next talk by Reverend Coates, I'd like to end by pointing out that Sadie Alexander always premised her calls for workers' rights on the basis of economic justice and morality. In 1963, in the midst of the civil rights movement, she said that all institutions in society, organized labor, governments, schools, industry, needed to come together to develop a comprehensive plan to ensure that people who experience neglect, deprivation, and discrimination could achieve their full potential. As far back as her 1921 dissertation, Sadie Alexander called on the Black church to use its revenues to build houses for Black migrants rather than additions to their churches. In the 1930s, Alexander elaborated on the role of the Black church by stating that they had an obligation and a special role to play in the struggle to improve life for poor Blacks, saying, quote, "Any program proposed for racial achievement must first consider the influence of the Negro church. The success of any plan to improve the status of our group must be dependent upon the cooperation of the Negro clergymen and Negro church, because they come nearer than any other group to controlling the thought of the masses. We must develop some plan by which this group of leaders will realize the social implications of Christian salvation. Jesus knew that if the lives of the poor were to be made happier, if their souls were to be made pure, there must be an improvement in their general social conditions. His sympathy for the poor did not stop with charity, but flowed out into a concept of social justice." Thank you.
Good afternoon. Can we give it up again for Dr. Camille? Thank you so much for that. You're going to have to show me going how to work these little device here. But good morning to all, good afternoon to all of you. And I'm just really honored and delighted to be with you this afternoon as part of this third annual MNT conference. I want to thank all of the conveners for inviting me to be here today to just talk a bit about the Our Money campaign, my journey to MNT, and to say a bit about my understanding of its connection to the civil rights struggle. Sorry,
we just decided to start doing an update.
Yeah. All right. Well, let me go ahead and get started. My name is Delman Coates again. I'm the organizer of the Our Money campaign, where our tagline is change money, change the world. I really believe that if we change the way we think about money, we can literally change the world. And so where does our money come from? Well, our money refers to our belief that money created by the government, as well as by banks and other private financial institutions, is fundamentally public in nature and is therefore our money. This is the basis of what we see as the strongest political and moral justification for asserting public control over the power of money creation. If it is our money, we should be able to say how it is allocated. Okay. There are three principal roots of our effort and of our campaign. The first principal goal of the Our Money campaign is to mainstream core insights of MMT to answer central questions of public finance. Questions that are always raised whenever robust spending proposals are put before our elected officials. How are we going to pay for it? Where is the money going to come from? The second goal of our campaign is to re-legitimize the power of money creation for purposes in the public interest. We seek to build a sustainable economy by shifting our nation's reliance on money created through private bank lending to money created through public spending. And third, our Money campaign seeks to build public support for robust policy proposals such as the federal job guarantee, Green New Deal, Medicare for all, free public college debt cancellation, and more federal spending for local and state priorities. Okay. I have spent, prior to launching our campaign this year, we've spent a great deal of time really building an incredible cast of advisory council members, many of whom are in this room today. I won't go through all of them. Have a slide for that, but the slide's not working. So let's keep going. I'm really delighted. We have two staffers on our team. Spencer Veal, is Spencer here? Spencer, raise your hand, is our policy director. And our program director, Dr. Tanika Scales, is not here this year. So let me say a bit about my journey to MMT. There are probably three principal influences that sort of shaped and informed how I ultimately arrived at MMT. The first is my theological and spiritual formation in the Black church in America. The Black church, for me, represents that subset of African American sacred spirituality that has been on the side of the fight for freedom, justice, and equality. The Black church tradition in America is that tradition of African American religiosity that has, as a consequence, helped to redeem the soul of America. I tend to distinguish the Black church from a church of Blacks, because every church of Blacks is not committed to this social justice tradition, but it is that Black church tradition that gave birth to me, and is very much a part of why I'm here today. Secondly, the second influence for me has a lot to do with my understanding of Which button should I have?
It's not going to sound.
Good. Okay. Just tell me what you wanted to.
It's okay. The second influence, next slide. The second influence really has a lot to do with my understanding of the economic justice roots of the civil rights movement. To a lot of extent, people focus on themes and issues around racial reconciliation as a key constituent element of the civil rights movement. But what is very formative to me is my understanding of the economic justice roots of the civil rights movement. Just think about those elements of Dr. King's speech in the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom, where in the middle of that speech, he says, quote, 100 years later, the Negro lives in a lonely island of poverty in the midst of a vast ocean of material prosperity. In a sense, we've come to our nation's capital to cash a check. It is obvious today that America has defaulted on this promissory note insofar as her citizens of color are concerned. Instead of honoring this sacred obligation, America has given the Negro people a bad check, a check which has come back marked insufficient funds. We refuse to believe that the Bank of Justice is bankrupt. We refuse to believe that there are insufficient funds in the great vaults of opportunity of this nation. So we have come to cash this check, a check that will give us, upon demand, the riches of freedom and the security of justice. Next slide. Also, if you think about Dr. King's remarks after the Greensboro lunch counter sit-ins in 1960, Dr. King said, what good is it for a person to have the right to sit at a lunch counter if he can't afford the hamburger, right? We also know that Dr. King launched the Poor People's Campaign and put forward an economic and social Bill of Rights that espoused, quote, a national responsibility to provide work for all. King advocated for a jobs guarantee, which would require the government to provide jobs to everyone who could not find one and end unemployment. The Bill of Rights also included, quote, the right of every citizen to a minimum income and the right to an adequate education. Next slide. I think it's important to remember certainly the work of Sadie Alexander, and we're thankful to Dr. Banks for really bringing her work to our knowledge and understanding. Additionally, Coretta Scott King continued this tradition by leading 1.2 million people in marches for a federal job guarantee in the 70s. She thought that economic security was the best way to buffer racial injustice in America. And one of the things for me that really stands out is that last speech that Dr. King gave on April the 3rd, 1968, where Dr. King, many people know this speech for this sort of language where King talks about going to the mountaintop, right, and seeing the other side. But we missed the middle portion of the speech, where Dr. King says, quote, I call upon you to take your money out of the banks downtown and deposit money in the Tri-State Bank. We want a bank-in movement in Memphis. So go to the Savings and Loan Association. I'm not asking you something we don't do ourselves at SCLC. Judge Hooks and others will tell you that we have an account here in the Savings and Loan Association from the SCLC. We're just telling you to follow what we're doing. Put your money there. You have 6 or 7 black insurance companies in Memphis. Take out your insurance there. We want to have an insurance in. Now, these are all practical things we can do, King said. We begin the process of building a greater economic base, right? So this sort of second influence from that leads me to MMT is my understanding of the economic justice roots and imperative of the civil rights movement. Then the third influence for me really has a lot to do with the global financial crisis. At our church in Clinton, Maryland, right outside of Washington, D.C., we provide emergency assistance for families that are being foreclosed on and evicted, right? And so in 2008 and 2009, I saw a huge uptick in the number of families coming to us for emergency assistance. And it seemed to be a crime that the very same institutions that caused the global financial crisis were getting bailed out, and my parishioners were getting put out, right? I just could not reconcile this, and I had deep fundamental problems with this. I really wanted to understand the root cause of the crisis, which ultimately led me to understanding the nature and the injustice inherent in our commercial bank money creation in America. And it really caused me to think a lot about something Dr. King quoted when he quoted Victor Hugo when he said, if a soul is left in darkness, sins will be committed. But the guilty one is not the one who commits the sins, but the one who causes the darkness. And I'll never forget in 2009 going to a meeting of bankers talking about the foreclosure crisis and all of my members who were being foreclosed upon. And all of the bankers laughed and assigned the blame to the members in my church. for taking out mortgages that they could not afford, for trying to flip houses, and took no ownership in the issue as well. And so I took it upon myself to say that I wanted to really commit to helping to build a moral economy, one that works for us, not one that works against us. And as a historian of religion, I'm acutely aware of the historic critique of money manipulation, often called usury, in the Abrahamic religions, and understood usury to be more than just the charging of excessive interest. Instead, my understanding of this sort of historical critique of the manipulation of money was much broader, where you had people like Aquinas who said that usury is the earning of interest on that which did not exist before, right? And so there's nothing that could be more usurious when one thinks about bank money creation in our society. So I knew as a leader that I had to play a role in helping to build a movement that addresses our unnecessary and imprudent reliance on commercial bank money, because it enabled commercial banks to receive profits off of credit money that they created out of nothing, causing wealth extraction, destabilizing our economy, and hurting the communities that I serve. I was first introduced to the whole notion of public money from the positive money AMI perspective, and eventually found MMT to be a much more pragmatic and intellectually rigorous understanding of how money works today. It gave me the conceptual tools for educating the public and politicians to re-legitimize the power of money creation for public purposes. I believe it was at the Democracy Convention in Minneapolis, where I had an opportunity at that time to hear Roy Gray speak, and had an opportunity to engage in a dialogue and conversation after both his presentation and my presentation as well. And a few months later, I got this random call from this white kid from California named Spencer Veal, who wanted to meet with me to talk about how we might reduce the dissonance between kind of a positive money perspective and MMT perspective. And I ultimately found MMT to be a much more credible framing for money. And I'm really just delighted to be at this point today. And so our campaign seeks to mainstream MMT through a series of both grassroots and grass top strategies. Some of you, since I've been here, have mentioned to me how you have read our opinion editorials, how you've read some of our written approaches to challenging mainstream and conventional economists for the way in which they seem to have this stronghold over political parties. And we've got to really push back on that. And so the recent op-ed that we did, if you haven't read No More Economic Malpractice, certainly want to encourage you to read that. But certainly we're also engaged in a series of grassroots efforts as well, because it is critically important that we expand the pool of people who are having this conversation. We have to expand the diversity, right? The pool of individuals who know about the core framing of MMT. That started for us in October of 2007, where we had, at 2017, where at my church, Dr. Banks talked about, Sadie Alexander talking about the role Black churches need to play. All of this is really being supported and resourced out of my local church by the voice and vision of a local pastor. And so in 2017, we held a 2-day symposium at our church on the mechanics of modern money. We had a host of economists there, and we had on the second panel a series of theologians and academics talking about how do we move towards a theology of economics. Because I really believe that the faith community can be key partners in expanding this conversation and moving our community and our nation and our world towards building and establishing a more just economy. I mentioned earlier that we spent a great deal of time from 2017 to 2019 cultivating a cohort of subject matter experts to be on our advisory panel. We've been conducting trainings all around the country. What I would do is I'll go around the country and I'll meet with 25 to 30 pastors principally African American pastors, and talk to them about MNT. We want to get them on board by understanding the core economic framing so that ultimately over time we can convert them into advocates and activists for this core economic framing. I say all the time, right, that I sort of envision myself as an evangelist for this message. And we need more leaders, more influencers becoming evangelists for this incredible good news that our economy, there's more resource, there's more potential, that our economy does not have to be predicated on scarcity, and we have to wait to tax Jeff Bezos and Amazon in order to have some of the great public priorities that we need to have. I don't want my community to have to wait, right, until we tax Jeff Bezos and Amazon. We need for us to get a dignified job and benefits, medical, for all the good we do, or to have our roads and infrastructure rebuilt in America. And so I've been going around the country doing trainings at Morehouse College. We trained about 200 pastors in Memphis, Tennessee in December of last year at the Congress of National Black Churches. We just did an awesome training at Hampton University at the Hampton Ministers Conference of about 75 clergy as well. We're going to continue to do this work, and in May of this year we launched the Our Money campaign. I think we go 2 slides ahead, Ron. We launched the Our Money campaign, and essentially what we're asking local churches and local leaders to do, we're asking them to do a few things. We're first asking them to bring together locally elected officials, your city council members, your members of your state legislature, and your members of Congress and their staff to hold sessions in which we are educating them about MNT. So on May 17th, when we first launched, we brought together 75 policymakers, organizers, and community leaders in our community in Maryland to talk about the power of the public purse, MNT, and the new economics for public finance, where many of them are understanding how MNT can be helpful for them, not just on these broad, robust federal policies like like federal jobs guarantee and things of this nature, but also on local and state priorities as well. Great conversation, great dialogue. And then the next day, we brought together 600 members of our community to have a community launch for the Our Money campaign, where we learned about MNT. And I want to say, I believe it was Rocco who was here yesterday. Did I pronounce your name correctly? Yes, you did. I think that we need to re-legitimize and affirm the voices of average, ordinary people to understand and to comprehend what might seem to be very high, complex concepts. I find when I get out around the country that people get it. People understand once it's explained to them in language that they can grasp that the government is not a household, right? They understand when they're explained, they understand the deficit myth and how deficit spending is net public money creation and how we need to, and then how this huge $21 trillion debt is not a record of the people that we owe, but it's a record of the amount of money that we spend. People get it, and I think that we need to accord them, the kind of respect and understanding that they deserve and affirm your voice. I want to thank you for your voice and Judson. Also, as a part of our grassroots efforts, next slide, so I've been going around the country doing educational sessions. The next slide, we've also been doing rallies and marches. We just had on Labor Day a few weeks ago a rally and march in Washington. It was a rally for full employment and economic justice, where we brought together 1,000 supporters, clergy, economists, and activists. I want to thank Andres and Raul for coming down and to be a part of that. And I'm really excited about the way in which we're seeking to expand the conversation and those who are at this table. Just 2 weeks after the march, I received a call from Representative Omar's office and some allies with Sunrise to be a part of the Federal Jobs Guarantee Development Act announcement. These members of Congress, Congresswoman Bonnie Watson Coleman, Congresswoman Omar, Congressman Bobby Rush from Illinois, were presenting the companion bill on the House side for Senator Booker's Federal Jobs Guarantee Development Act. Yes, it could be better, it could be more robust, but I think it constitutes and represents a start for what we're doing. Next slide. We're seeking right now there are a series of tactics. If you can go to other tactics, there's a series of robust tactics that we're seeking to put together now. The next slide after that, Ron. We're seeking to develop local chapters based on congressional districts around the country to educate citizens on how to express their policy demands to the members of Congress and elect new members of Congress if necessary. We're also training our money ambassadors. Our whole strategy is we want to influence the influencers. So there are clergy, there are people, there are individuals who lead organizations who have membership bases that could be labor leaders, civil rights leaders, clergy. We're seeking to influence the influencers to really get the MMT message. We're engaged in issue-based lobbying, in which we are right now pushing for congressional hearings on MMT. We need a congressional hearing on MMT, and we need citizens who are demanding that the House Financial Services Committee, the House Budget Committee, and Senate Finance Committee conduct hearings on MMT. We recently submitted, a request to the Congressional Research Service to respond to, I believe it was 32 or 38 questions about the core economic framing for MMT. What I found in 2018 is that many of our members of Congress rely on the counsel and advice of the Congressional Research Service, and Congressman Bobby Rush was willing to submit a series of 32 questions about the core economic framing of MMT. We recently had their response to that, and I'm really excited to hear about the work that Nathan talked a bit about yesterday. I'm really looking forward to his report on credit controls on commercial bank money creation as a means of checking inflation. So I think I've said enough. I want to thank all of you for allowing me to be here today, but it is incumbent upon us to get outside of the four walls of this space and to share with Lottie Dottie and everybody about the good news, the message of modern monetary theory that's going to help us address our existential threat and help us create a more community that puts us all together rather than the insanity that we're hearing today that is pulling us apart. Thank you so much.
So, wow. While Rohan is getting set up, I just feel like, I don't know, I'm not sure what to add to what you just said. Everything that you've said is like so incredible, so strategic, so exactly what we need. I was lucky enough to be at the first MMT conference in Kansas City and the conference last year. And what you presented, I think, is like a quantum leap forward. Not a step forward, but a quantum leap forward. So I'm going to just kind of give a little bit of context of what we did on the Fed Up campaign and some of the work that I'm doing in Iowa right now with an organization called Iowa Citizens for Community Improvement. That's a community-based organization, but while this is also getting set up, I just want to say that in 4 years of working on Fed Up, we never had 1,000 people show up to a protest. We never had that. And Delman, how many people are in your church? So there are 10,000 people in Delman's church, and you're part of a network of progressive ministers, right? And how many people are in that? About 200 pastors. So 200 pastors that each have congregations of about 10,000 people.
Well, not 10,000, let's get right.
Well, it's a range, but it's like such an incredible opportunity, there's so much power there, and I think the way that we're approaching congressional staffers, congressional briefings, the Congressional Research Service, it's just incredibly strategic program. All right. Okay, hi. When I started, I just want to tell you a little about me and myself and like how I came into this work a little bit. So this is my family. I'm in the bottom right corner. This was the best picture that I could get that day. My family are Indian immigrants, and we moved to Iowa in the early 1980s. My dad was an engineer by training, but when he came to Iowa, he was only able to get a job at a foundry in Oskaloosa making fire hydrants. And he was quickly laid off when I was 2 years old. And he was caught up in the early 1980s recession with the rest of the country and the rest of Iowa in particular. So in the early 80s, we had, I'm not sure if people know this history, but the early 80s recession hit Iowa so hard that people drove their tractors from Iowa all the way to the US Capitol and set them on fire. So this is what we were caught up in, and our family was unemployed for 5 years. We have stories of government cheese. I still remember going to the Iowa State University meat lab in order to get meat because students would practice butchering things and they would sell the meat at a discount. And our family still has scars from that. If anyone here has been unemployed before, you know that it never really leaves you, and to be the father of a young family that you can provide for on food stamps and like how we were demonized in that way, just for seeking assistance, the scars still last to the point that like my parents today still do not buy new clothes. They still only buy clothes from the Salvation Army because they feel like at any moment everything can be taken away from them. And what's most frustrating and angering about this is I think what Camille said, which was these were choices that people made. These were choices that a few people made not to fund what we needed, right? Not to fund the job guarantee. Like the fact that my dad and so many people across Iowa and so many people across the country were unemployed was a choice made by a few people. And since our family came to this country, this graph you can see goes, we came in the early 1980s, and the middle class share of income has just gone down, right? And so has union membership. And we've all seen this graph before where our productivity has kept going up and our compensation has stayed flat. And that's the entirety of my life and my experience in the United States, is stagnant wages and unnecessary pain because of the decisions of a few people. And one big part of this was the financial crash of 2008 and 2009, and Delman mentioned that the very people who caused the crash were the ones who got bailed out. And actually, what we needed in that moment, which was a massive economic stimulus, a massive fiscal stimulus, was stymied by people who did not understand the economy and who gave us a fraction of what we needed. And as a result of that, we've had one of the longest, most drawn out and painful recoveries in history that has resulted in eventually, after 10 long years, low unemployment, but no rise in wages. And all of these, again, I just want to emphasize this point, are choices, right? Like the fact that Larry Summers decided that we shouldn't get the stimulus that we needed was a choice by one elite white person to put mostly, and at every point of this, it is mostly and disproportionately Black and brown people and immigrants who have to bear the pain and the lasting scars of not being able to provide for their families, of going hungry, of not being able to go to school. It is elite white decision makers who decide that the rest of us deserve that type of pain. And so, in the aftermath of the 2008 crash, right, Fed Up started in 2014 at this moment when people, some of those elite white decision makers were saying that unemployment can't get any lower than 7%. That's it. Everyone who's unemployed, which was at the time 20% of Black people, deserve to be unemployed. And that's the way the economy should function. And there was a strong debate at the Federal Reserve that that is the maximum level of unemployment, and that's when Fed Up started. And we did a series of direct actions, and we started with direct actions at Jackson Hole at their annual conference, and we organized Black and brown workers, and we primarily organized people who are already organized into community-based organizations like Make the Road New York, if you've heard of them, or New York Citizens for Community Change, and organizations across the country who were fighting on economic justice issues, who were fighting on the fight for 15, on paid family leave, and on fair schedules, and we made a simple proposition to them that each of your economic justice fights is infinitely harder the higher the unemployment rate is. And the lower the unemployment rate is, it's going to make all of these other issues that you're already engaged on and already organized into a lot easier. And by doing direct action, we were able to get a lot of media attention. Direct action, I think, importantly, that was completely organized and executed by the people most affected, by the people who suffered the most under these arbitrary choices. So low-income people, unemployed people, and Black and brown people who were disproportionately affected. And we got coverage in we typically, while the campaign was running, would get like about 100 pieces of press a year in major outlets, like extensive coverage in the Washington Post, the New York Times, and other outlets. And I think like the key lesson here is that people power needs to be made visible, right? Like that we have all of this power among us, and Delman is a great illustration of that. But in order for it to work, people power needs to be made visible. And a lot of you know the person who started the Fed Up campaign, the person who hired me and gave me my first job out of law school. It's Adi Barkan. And you know, Adi is an incredibly brilliant person who saw this opportunity and saw just kind of like strategically how all of this could work, saw a pretty small monetary policy press corps, saw a few targets, and built connections with community-based organizations of Black and brown people. And I'm just like so thankful that I got to be part of it at the beginning and helping build it. And right now, Adi is probably the most important activist in the country fighting for Medicare for all. And you know, Adi has ALS. He was diagnosed with ALS just a couple of weeks before the 2016 election. And I was with him in Santa Barbara watching the election. There were, and I won't ever forget that, you know, like, we talked about his diagnosis for a couple of weeks, and I had not seen him show emotion or cry. But as the results of the election came in and it became clear that Donald Trump was going to win, he started like sobbing in his father's arms for the first time that I saw him. And he said that when he got his diagnosis, his own world was shattered, but after the election, he felt like the whole world was shattered. It was, and now, Adi, it's 3 years later, and at that time, Adi was still talking and walking and running, and now Adi has a ventilator. He just got a ventilator put into his lungs. And in Japan, where they have universal health care, 90% of the people with ALS get a ventilator and continue to live and continue to do things like write Adi's book that he just wrote and like have interviews with these presidential candidates. He's able to do a lot. In the US, 90% of people choose not to do that. And it's all because of money. It's all because people say we can't afford it. And I just wanted to kind of ground us in this because these are just like my own personal stories. We all have these stories where because a few people try to tell us we don't have enough money, they push us into life and death decisions that we don't need to make. They make these arbitrary decisions based on debunked theories, based on refusing to look at the data, and then meanwhile, we have to make those life and death decisions. And Adi is the person that pulled me into this work, and right now his life hangs in the balance because people are telling us that we don't have the money for Medicare for all. So after that day, I left Iowa. I was born and raised in Iowa. I left Iowa about 15 years ago, and after the election, I couldn't recognize where I grew up. This map on the left is Iowa in 2008. In 2008, Iowa had a Democratic governor, we had a Democratic House, we had a Democratic Senate, and Obama won the state by 10 points. And in 2016, Trump won the state by 10 points. The highest number of Obama to Trump counties in the country is in Iowa. So Iowa is a small state with an absolutely indefensible amount of influence in the presidential process, but it's also emblematic of a lot of the things that we need to be grappling with going forward. And one of them is that in that long, painful recovery, rural areas did not have the same recovery as the rest of the, did not even have that same inadequate, and prolonged recovery. Rural communities just didn't get it. And, I think other folks on the panel had, other folks on the panel, like Dr. Banks, have mentioned this and the insights of Sadie Alexander, seeing the intertwining of economic devastation and racism, right? So when my family was caught up in the 1980s recession, we didn't cause that. We weren't the ones that made the decisions that caused that recession, but we were blamed for it, right? People didn't look up to the people who made those decisions. They looked across the street to the brown person and the brown family that were easier to blame. And I know that in my family, and I know that across the country, that when we arbitrarily choose to put people in economic distress, the people who hurt the most and the people who become most vulnerable are Black people and brown people like my family. So now we have a totally different situation, right? I think people are incredibly obsessed with the 2020 election so early on because we're anxious to make a change, and Iowa is a key place. It's a hinge point where that change is possible, and we have a ridiculous and crazy number of options here. But what's more important is what we have on the table, right? So on the table, we've got a Green New Deal, we've got Medicare for all, we've got free college. People are talking about these big, bold, progressive ideas for the first time in a long time or ever, maybe. And the question that I'm hearing on the ground, which I think will be a rolling question as this frenzy and circus moves across the country, is like people love these ideas. These ideas are incredibly popular, but the one thing that keeps coming up is how do we pay for it? So how do we communicate MMT to the general public? How do we make the substantive case to non-subject matter experts who have a lot of influence in making this change? And who we need to be making the case to? So this is a Des Moines Register poll that happened in March, just a couple months ago. And in this poll, healthcare, when people were asked what should the candidates talk a lot about, healthcare was number one with 81%, and climate change was number two with 80%. And that climate change number is incredible because I don't think even in 2016 or in 2018, climate change was a top 10 issue. And then they did a poll of likely Iowa Democratic caucus goers, and the Green New Deal had a 91% approval rating among likely Democratic caucus goers, and Medicare for All had an 84% approval rating. So these policies are incredibly popular. But private companies and like huge corporations are obviously spending millions of dollars, and they will only ramp this up. Right now, they're spending millions of dollars in Iowa alone. If you open YouTube or Hulu or anything with an ad, you will see this ad from the Partnership for America's Healthcare Future, which is a front group for like chambers of commerce and things like that. And what the message of it is whether it's Medicare for All or Medicare buy-in or a public option, it's all the same, and it all just means higher taxes, right? So that is the message that is being flooded into Iowa, trying to gnaw away at that common sense consensus that people are already at. But there's millions of dollars being invested to try to undermine it. And it's somewhat working, right? So that previous poll I showed you was from March. This poll just came out last week, and it shows that 41% of Democratic caucus goers support Medicare for All, and another 28% are personally comfortable with the policy, but fear it could cost the party the election. And that, to me, is entirely because of paranoia about the question of how you pay for it. So we went from a massive consensus of 84% to just under half who are unequivocally for it, and a significant portion who would be for it, who know that it's the right policy, but are afraid because corporations have chosen to make them afraid. The same goes for the Green New Deal. 48% of people support it unequivocally, and 12% say that they're worried that it's bad for the party. So how do we fight back against this message? How do we fight back against the millions and millions of dollars that is trying to undermine this kind of core common sense consensus? I think like you all as a group of MMTers are really lucky that one of your leading intellectual lights is also a brilliant messenger. Stephanie Kelton, I think, like has given me so much guidance in terms of like how to talk about these issues. And this is, I think like this ultimately is the best thing that we can say to people. This is from AOC. We write unlimited blank checks for war. We just wrote a $2 trillion check for the GOP tax cut, and nobody asked those folks, how are they going to pay for it? So my question is, why are our pockets only empty when it comes to education and healthcare for our kids? So, in my experience, having conversations with people in Iowa that come through our office, that we're organizing into direct actions against the Partnership for this Healthcare Future, against big corporate ad companies, against all these targets going into direct actions, the question I ask them is the same. How did we pay for the New Deal? How did we pay for World War II? How did we pay for the Iraq War? How did we pay for the War on Terror? How did we pay for the tax cut, right? Like, and that usually stops people in their tracks. I think another thing that just came out, I believe last week, was this answer from Naomi Klein when someone asked her, aren't you worried about the future for your son if we run up these massive, massive deficits? I'm not sure exactly how to play this, but I'll just paraphrase. Did anyone see this? Right? So what she said was, I'm a lot more worried that we are causing massive environmental devastation that we will never be able to replenish. I'm worried that we are going to acidify the oceans and make it so there are no fish in the ocean. I'm worried that we are going to kind of create deserts all across the world. Like, those are the deficits I'm worried about. I'm not worried about the government deficit. And I think that's another incredibly powerful message that works with people. So this is a little bit of guidance, right? So we'll pay for the Green New Deal like we have always paid for other progressive priorities, for the same way we pay for all other government spending. The constraint isn't money, it's political will. History's on our side. We've faced global crises before by the government mobilizing massive public resources, and we can do it again. And also, there is an army of economists that can back us up. So, and you can't really see the bottom line of this, but really for 95% of people, this is all they need, right? What they're in the fight for and what they're in the fight for the future for is the Green New Deal. They're in the fight for their children to have a livable future. They're in the fight for Medicare for all, for people in their family who are rationing insulin and who are actually are on the brink of death just because they don't have enough money. That's why they're in the fight, and if you can just give them a credible, short explanation that this can work, and there's a lot of people who, like, if you're interested, you can, like, talk to them. That's all that's really necessary, and that's all that people are really interested in. Like, I have not talked to anyone who's really asked me to send them 10 YouTube links to MMT lectures yet. So if people want to get into the weeds, and this is typically for more like professional staff who are in like political organizations or issue-based organizations, what I generally say is that the limit of what we can spend is not what we collect in taxes. The limit is inflation, and that means so much more is possible than the current conversation allows. So to spend $1, we don't need to collect $1 in taxes first. Our government spending is much higher than what we can collect in taxes. And this classic quote that Dick Cheney said, Reagan proved that deficits don't matter. I can show them this. I showed this presentation to the US Climate Action Network, which has about 500 groups in it. And there was some interest and some questions, but in general, everyone was very into it and got it. So you all know this stuff. So then the other thing that I told them was, we can talk about taxes, but we need to decouple the tax conversation from the paying for it conversation. Taxes are useful as a way to deconcentrate wealth, as a way to stop bad behavior, but they are not necessary to pay for what we need. So let's tax the rich, let's tax polluters, but let's not be constrained by what we can collect in taxes. So I can tell you in my experience, kind of in Iowa at the intersection of a lot of different groups fighting for these big ideas, this has been useful and people get it, and this is kind of like all that they really need. And the key is to do what Delman is doing, is to be like spreading this message out to as many people as we can. And this is just a very impartial list, but there are mass mobilizations of people who are organized around Medicare for All, and they should know about MMT. They should know that anytime someone asks them how to pay for it, that's not a real question. There's obviously a massive movement on the Green deal, and the same thing. Like they should just be able to stop the how do you pay for it conversation in its tracks. And then of course, like when it comes to making this real in the political arena, who has power and who mobilizes in politics, right? It's like Black people, people of color. Like we need to spread this message and get more of the leadership and like make more entry points with like folks like Delman who are part of massive organized networks that are people who are already ready to take action. And then there's a huge opportunity with the presidential campaigns right now. I can say, like, sitting in Iowa, we have like a tremendous, and I work for the largest progressive organization in the state of Iowa, and we have a lot of access, and there's a lot of stuff that's still in flux, and people are still writing their plans and still taking input. So now is the time also to be injecting this into the presidential political conversation. And that's my presentation.
Hello. Okay. So let's give another round of applause for all of our speakers. And I have some questions for you all that kind of loop in each other's work. So there will be some questions that are kind of in groups. And the first is for Shawn and Dr. Walsh, and it's related to something that you mentioned in your book, where you said that Trump's presumptive status as a tax-paying citizen candidate is deeply rooted in the historical alliance between taxpayer, citizen, and white that have been deployed to help justify and alibi racial inequality. Because these categories have been so enmeshed historically, I'd like for you and Shawn to maybe speak to how MMT, just kind of thinking ahead at some solutions, how can MMT, if possible, play a role in breaking up these presumptions, because we associate whiteness with being deserving and a tax-paying citizen so closely. How do we break that apart?
That's a really good question. I wondered about myself. I think one mechanism is what several panelists have already said, something related to defining tax paying and the process of taxes as essentially an inflation reduction tool, like an inflation tool, not as a point of, I really sympathize with the sense that taxes are a sense you're giving to people that you can't see in some way, and there's something kind of wonderful in the taxpayer process in that way. But I think we just need to reframe the discourse to focus on its economic implications and reaffirm that you earn your rights and you earn your personhood through being a person and not through this individual tax liability in a given year. I think one of the things when I was talking about the Trump example is Breitbart published a series of maps leading up to the 2016 election. And it was based on a lot of maps that were circulating, like the New York Times and elsewhere, that were like rooted in who could vote in 1787 or who could vote in 1853. So it was sort of like related to race and gender dynamics in those maps, rooted in historical actual facts. And then Breitbart made one that said, what if only taxpayers could vote? And what they really meant is, what if white people could vote? And that was actually the data that they drew from to make their map, which just shows the collusion of the two concepts.
I don't have much to add except that, what your presentation made me think of is that the way like people identify as taxpayers act, it's like a lot of can I talk to your manager energy, right? Like where it's like I've paid for this service and I deserve, you need to listen to me. And I think the more that we decouple those things, that assumption just breaks down. If schools were actually paid by federal money, and that federal money was understood to not be tax dollars, I think it would just do so much to undermine the basic logic. And it would equip other people engaged in making those people to just completely brush them aside. So I think it's really powerful.
To add one thing, so that people understand that if you say I'm a taxpayer, you might as well be saying I'm a white person, I'm a rich person, I'm a person who owns a home. It's in the statement of entitlement and privilege, and we're usually uncomfortable with those public statements, so maybe I'm a taxpayer should be in that realm.
And Shawn, if you could maybe add to that in terms of what you've seen in the field, so in terms of kind of organizing tactics, how do you have this conversation kind of one-on-one with people, and what have been your experiences with having these types of conversations?
It's kind of like what I said. I mean, I think that people are really motivated by the policy and the promise of the policy. Like in Iowa, for example, all of the water is poisoned by the corporate agriculture industry. There's 23 million pigs in Iowa and 3 million people, and it produces as much waste on a per square mile basis as Bangladesh. It has the equivalent of a waste density as Bangladesh.
Is that where the feral hogs were?
No, that's not where the feral hogs are. These are different. But yeah, so like 300 people get cancer from nitrate poisoning a year, and people can't drink the water. So when they hear about a Green New Deal, they're thinking about their water, right? They're not thinking about how you pay for it, and all they need is something where it's like, oh my God, my uncle on Facebook was saying that this is going to ruin the country, and all they need is someone who's confident, being like, that's not true, this is not the way it works, the government doesn't work like a household, and there's a whole army of economists that can tell you the same, and I can point them to you if you want, and then generally they're just like, no, I just needed to hear that. Like, I just needed to know that that's the case, yeah.
This question is for Dr. Banks. You wrote that Sadie Alexander feared that white Americans would be willing to sacrifice freedoms and civil liberties in exchange for the vague promises of a self-proclaimed Messiah who claimed that he could fix all their economic problems, obviously drawing very clear parallels to the 2016 and the election of Donald Trump. So my question to you is that, yes, they're willing to sacrifice these freedoms, but whose freedoms are they thinking they're sacrificing? Because as Dr. Walsh talked about, there's kind of this sense that that's what happened to other people. And you heard, maybe some news reports of Trump voters who said, I didn't think it would happen to me and my family. I didn't think it would happen to my wife or my husband if they got deported. So how do you sense that kind of interaction between people who think these are my freedoms and I don't mind sacrificing them, and others who don't even think that that applies to them, even if it could? It might be kind of a big, broad question. So how do you kind of reconcile these two beliefs between people thinking that they're sacrificing their own freedoms and liberties by electing somebody like Donald Trump, and other people who don't even realize that they can be in that equation because they kind of push it onto others? It's only other people whose freedoms will be sacrificed by elect, someone who's dogmatic and dictatorial.
I guess I hadn't really thought about it. I suppose it goes back to her arguments about the need to always explain economic activities and economic downturns in particular in plain language. I mean, that was something that she always emphasized. And so that white Americans in particular could understand that this is something that will pass. She wasn't talking about it in the context, obviously, of money, but in the way that it's framed in this conference. But she was talking about it in terms of government spending. And so I think to the question of democratic rule, her concern was that white Americans also needed to be aware that any violation of the rule of law, engaging in unlawful behavior towards racial ethnic groups, for example, that it also undermined the rule of law more generally. So I guess it's more esoteric than something that she would have stated more plainly. I mean, even though she's advocating people talk plainly about the economy, but in terms of her democratic issues, the argument was that if white Americans were comfortable with the erosion of civil liberties for African Americans, then eventually could come back and also haunt them in terms of their own ability to exercise their civil liberties.
So, Dr. Coates, I grew up also in a Black church, not a church of Blacks. And so I want to address this article that you wrote, that you had an excerpt up there in your PowerPoint. And in that letter to sojourners, you talked about kind of the role of civil rights, of the Black church in the civil rights struggle. But we know that it has also promoted some conservative values, that those churches are Black, not the Black church, right? And some of those clergy were a part of the groups who advocated for the crime bill. But this letter that you wrote, featuring almost 24 clergy members, clergymen and women, they all supported this letter. They all signed on to this letter. So I'm curious as to if this is like a generational shift. Is this something that has changed from the clergy in the 80s and 90s who adopted this conservatism? Or is there something else? Is this a different group of folks? Are you coming from a different ideology? If you could just kind of talk about maybe what's going on there.
It's a good question. I'm not sure it's a generational thing, because I think when you look at this cohort of clergy, they span a variety of generations. There are some 30s, 50s, 70s. I think what's happening is that folks in the Black community have realized that those whom we have given economic stewardship, who have presided over the failure of our economy in the 90s under Clinton, in the early and under Obama, that they don't deserve our trust any longer. And so I think what's happening is that the times are right now for people to say, why should we continue to assume that people like, Bob Rubin or Larry Summers necessarily deserve our continued support, because they have presided over the destruction of our economy, the undermining of our community. And so I think people are now looking for an alternative framework for thinking about how we're going to address mass incarceration, protecting our planet, and providing health care for everyone. And so I think this is what it's about. I think that the very people that we trusted have forsaken the sacred trust, for lack of a better term, of those who now lead these institutions. I will say that it's critically important that we get this message out, because what I see now are the same tactics that were being promoted to Black people in the 90s being promoted again. In the 90s, there was an attempt to get Black clergy on board with a series of policies that supported relying on financing as a means for addressing issues in the Black community. A whole host of Black clergy who were going around the country saying, if you just get a house, Black people just go get a house. That's the way to kind of get wealth. It's going to save your family. It's proven to be the means of, getting wealth in America. And right now, we see the very same strategies that were used in the mid-90s being used again with Black clergy and with other leaders, encouraging a kind of reliance on financing and the financial sector, whether it's through these opportunity zone schemes or public-private partnership schemes and a range of other strategies. So the time is now for us to get out before leaders and influencers to let them understand how, rather that we cannot continue to rely on the very same sector that is.
So I want to leave some time for audience questions, and I've got one question that's going to apply to all the panelists. And it's kind of, I'm getting at it in a sort of roundabout way, because this kind of applies to what everybody was saying up here in terms of, there's a saying that when America gets a cold, Black people get the flu. In terms of the disproportionate effects of what happens under industrialization, what happens under capitalism, what happens when we have a very individualistic value system, it's Black and brown people who get their lives get kind of torn apart the most. And it relates to some research Dr. Shaw actually really closely. I started my political reporting really focusing on the Midwest and looking at the impact of deindustrialization in the Midwest and how it affects people's electoral choices, their decisions. And so there's this assumption, especially because of 2016, there's this assumption that what happened there is that Trump just captivated everybody's minds in rural communities in the Midwest. But what also happened, that didn't happen, but what also happened is that you had a lot of Black disillusionment. And I was looking at Wisconsin in particular, where Hillary Clinton didn't visit the state at all while she was a candidate, while she had a nomination. So that was one thing, but on top of that, Milwaukee is 40% Black. A lot of people don't realize that. It's about 40% Black, which is more than Brooklyn, more than Houston, more than Dallas. At one point, it was more than the Bronx, more than Los Angeles, more than a lot of places where, in our imagination, they're Black cities. Milwaukee has about 40% Black people, 47% Black male joblessness, which is the highest in the country, and about half the Black men there have been involved in the incarceration system in some form or another, which is the highest in the country as well. And so with that, I've been continuing my research here, and we are proposing now, just kind of looking at that, we're proposing MMT, we're proposing democratic socialism, we're proposing socialism as ways for people to all benefit where there's this extensive crisis. But I went there just a couple of weeks ago. Walmart now has I told you this is going to be a long-winded way to be here. But Walmart imposed, they've got a $15 minimum wage right now. But what they ended up doing is firing a bunch of Black workers and then rehiring them as temp workers if they don't have benefits. So how do we then say, okay, moving on in this utopian society where we have government spending, where we are actually giving people equal access to those rights? How do we change people's kind of value system? How do we change their minds? And it kind of goes to my first question. How do we do that? And I'd like for everybody to kind of chime in on that. How do we do that so everyone is having equal access to these new rights that we intend to have?
I don't know. Because I think there's a really important question that we haven't asked, right? So you gave us a list of questions, and one was this big question: how do we pay for it? Right, the myth, right? How do we pay for it? But the other big reason why I think so many white Americans tend to be opposed to so many wonderful universal programs is because they know somehow that people of color will disproportionately benefit. And that's a big problem in this country, and it's of course tied to this taxpayer trope. So we have to tackle that somehow, which is, I think, part of what you're asking. And I don't have an answer for that, but we have to tackle it. The sense of resentment that white Americans have when they think that health insurance or education, whatever the benefit is, will disproportionately benefit people of color. Food stamps is a good example. Vote against that. They'll vote against that even if they receive it because they think that Black people are disproportionately benefited. Right? So we can't overlook the issue of race.
Yeah, there was a book that came out recently called Dying of Whiteness, and it was a public health professional who did these studies and interviews, and I think like Medicaid expansion happened in Kentucky, but did not happen in Tennessee, or maybe the other way around. But there was, a 20-mile gap between people who had Medicaid expansion and who didn't. And he interviewed a person who was on the side that didn't have it, and he was like, aren't you angry? Like, you could be getting the care you need, but you're in this terrible situation, and if you live 20 miles over, you would have everything that you needed. And he said, I'd rather die than have Obamacare. So I think this is a tension that I'm grappling with, because in a certain way, what we're dealing with is a deep psychological problem where people see white supremacy as property, and I'm not sure if a robust economic program can fix that. But yeah, it's the only thing that I can think of, so.
Yeah, I mean, two things. One, I think, as I said as well, but we have to use MMT not just for its explanatory power around taxing and spending currency, but to address this myth of scarcity that is so effectively used as a political tool to create resentments and also to like stoke the flames of insecurity and anxiety. You know, things that like all human beings have anxiety about where their next meal is going to come from, right? So if you stoke those flames effectively enough, we're going to get a lot of votes, and you can like build it on the foundation of white supremacy. But I think there's another answer in relation to sort of eliminating that constant threat of scarcity, which is education. And this is partly why I study K-12 education. I also teach a human rights class where I constantly am invoking for students that they need to remove the logic of sentimentalism from how they view human rights, because it always becomes like, oh, woe is the children, like if something happens to a child, it's worse than if it happens to an adult, which doesn't really make sense if a human person's all that value. But I think in education, I'm not studying it for the children, but I'm fascinated by the fact that when you look at a 10-year-old child and you say, the fact that you're a parent doesn't pay enough in taxes, or doesn't live in the right zip code, or it means that you don't get access not just to education, to whatever else. Your logic of both meritocracy but also deep enough taxation entitling you to rights is gone, right? It doesn't make any sense that your parents' taxes entitle you to specific things. And if we focus on building up really robust, funded, equitable education systems, then we could actually teach the next generation to save us. Because I'm not saying we're others, but we're reliant on them for a lot of things.
Well, in addition to what's been said, I will say I do apologize for having to dip out at 4 o'clock flight from ICE. We have church tomorrow. I think one of the things that MMT does is it helps us to deconstruct the myth of who the largest recipients of public supports are in our society, right? So the largest recipients of public aid and public support in our society, you know, are the bankers, right? When one understands how the public subsidizes so-called private bank money creation, the largest recipients of public support, public aid, public subsidies are not, you know, people of color receiving, you know, health care or job guarantee. The largest recipients of public support and public aid, you know, are the big 5 banks. And so for me, I would try to begin to deconstruct this red herring is to focus on the true recipients of the largest public subsidies in our society.
Hi, I'm Steve from Moderator. I want to thank each and every one of you all for this great panel. One of the things that I wanted to make mention, obviously I'm white, and but I fell apart during the global financial crisis. And while I'm very progressive, I'm not unlike many Trump voters. I look like them, oftentimes sound like them. There's a lot of things that you could see in my life that mirror them. And one of the things that drew me to MMT not only was the fact that my own demise, but I want to say my name with my title so you understand that this can happen to anyone. My name is Stephen B. Grumbine, MS, MBA, PMP, PSL1, ITIL. And I have an extensive resume. And I was unemployed for almost a year, this past year. And the only thing that kept me from hanging in my basement was the fact that I got a child with autism who will never probably be independent a day in his life. And if I don't live forever, who's going to take care of them? So I want you all to understand that there's a lot of people out there that are in disadvantaged communities that maybe aren't of color, but that can build huge coalitions to take this, because this is very real to me. This isn't for some fun thing, you know. I am constantly on edge, living like a feral cat. And and I am very well educated. I can teach at the university if I wanted to. And I am literally on that precipice myself. And when I talk to people outside of these rooms, this is what they're seeing. And when I hear you all are saying, every one of you, it's incredibly powerful. I mean, your story in particular, I sat there and like inside, I felt this boom. You know, I mean, this is what's going on. So I guess my question to you is, how can we marry the commonality to lift the other people that are more in the vulnerable spectrum? How can we lift them into this coalition of the oppressed so that we really can lift all ships? Because this is the beauty of MMT. Well, I really hear from you. I really feel this is like the most important thing in the end, because we're not going to win without each other. Thanks.
I can start. I hear your story. I'm so sorry that happened to you. But one thing that I would say is all of these stories resonate with me as well. I think that we have to think about the people who are not able to access the dignity claims to citizenship or citizenship itself, right? Like the dignity claims of citizenship scholars have talked about, oh, you earn your sort of symbolic citizenship through being a worker. So if you can say like, I'm a worker, I have a job, I'm employed, right? Okay, then you get some respect and some dignity and validation, or reproductive citizenship is another form, like I'm a parent, I'm a mother, I'm a father, and so again, I've earned some value in society's eyes. In the third category, historically, I mean, there's a bunch of categories. The other one has been warrior citizens. So I'm a veteran, I was in the military, I served the country through taking up arms. There are newer categories, consumer citizenship, right? I grew my citizenship through how much I buy. All of these things are not things that we should ever be buying into because they always exclude people, and the populations that they're excluding are those that are always outcast, the people in the streets, the homeless, the people who are suffering in the worst ways. So we just have to remember that.
Thank you for your question. Two quick things because I have to leave. I've got 3 trains to catch so I can get home to my son who's caring for our dogs on his own. I think that white people need to raise the consciousness of other white people. People of color can't do it as effectively as white people, and I think it needs to happen. And then the second thing, and I don't mean to trivialize it, but I really do think that, and to go back to Sadie Alexander's arguments and the arguments of so many people in this room, I think that a federal jobs guarantee would go a long way towards diminishing the pain that people feel because they can't get a job. It should be a right of citizenship.
So I work in Iowa right now, which is a 90% white state. So this is a lot of what I do is I organize young people and people of color in coalition with white people and older people. And we just had a presidential forum with Sanders, Warren, Castro, and Buttigieg, and we had a third generation 80-year-old white Iowa farmer standing on stage with a Honduran farm worker labor organizer, and what he said was that the same evil that drives Iowa farmers to suicide is the same evil that's assassinating labor organizers in Honduras, and that's corporate power. And I think that's the message that we need to be telling, because a lot of people can see themselves in that. Like, stop dividing ourselves between left and right and start between the few at the top and the many of us at the bottom.
Hi, thank you. So one of the things I appreciated about the panel was that people brought up Alexander and King and Scott King, not only as organizers, but also as political theorists and as strategists. Because one of the concerns I have about MMT in relation to this panel is that, MMT is predominantly white theorist. And it's, connected to the whiteness of econ in terms of, the paucity of people of color and Black people who are getting PhDs in economics. And a lot of times, there's this kind of push for people of color and Black people to be kind of foot soldiers in organizing, like masses of people, particularly organizing masses of Black people and people of color. But the theory is still oftentimes kind of this progressive colorblind theory, or it's still a theory that's kind of mainly created and circulated in kind of white spaces. And that concerns me because that replicates a lot of kind of tendencies of leftist and progressive organizing, where there's this kind of divide between so-called thinkers and strategists, and then people of color and Black people often are kind of tasked with certain labor, which is very vital and important, and organizing is strategizing and theorizing, but it also comes with a lot of different kind of risk, physically, kind of clearly, socially, and all this stuff. It often also comes with a lot of times not having some of the levels of job security. So there's stuff where I'm a little concerned about kind of, I get why we want to spread science or why people would want to. A lot of the policy agendas are important. I think a lot of the messaging is important, and a lot of the trying to debunk a lot of these myths in terms of how they circulate. But I'm a little concerned about kind of the setup of what this could mean in terms of kind of the replication of certain kind of racial inequalities regarding labor and regarding kind of who gets to dominate the theorizing, the intellectual kind of work decides that this is the messaging, or that decides this is kind of how we're going to think through these issues. And then who's being tasked with kind of bringing people in, and particularly bringing people of color into that kind of dynamic.
Well, I don't know if the panelists want to address that, but I can speak from my experience. Is that, you know, Raul and Rowan are two friends of mine, and so I think a lot of it is sometimes not necessarily intentional forms of exclusion, but it's just by virtue of their network. And so we went to a predominantly white law school, so that tends to be, you know, what you would be attracted to. But I think that there are ways to build alliances, even when you think about the people that have theory. And that was the purpose of having this panel to begin with. So, I mean, you're sitting in a panel that was intended to kind of bring that conversation in where it wasn't necessarily in the fold before. I think it's going to be a long process because, you know, we have kind of been in this situation. We've created these circumstances over decades and decades of kind of marginalizing Black thought and scholarship for people of color and for women. So I think it's going to take some time. But I think sometimes it's not necessarily nefarious. A lot of it is like, what is the network? And who, you know, they just call me up. And I was like, okay, I can moderate this panel. So I think sometimes it requires that sort of networking. And you can, you know, talk to them. And if you have a panel, then I'm sure that that's like something that can also be brought into the fold.
I have too much to add, especially I don't know much about the organizing, but yeah, I think this is just such a long-standing problem on the left that it needs to always be raised and needs to have attention brought to it.
Yeah, I agree.
So yeah, that's a question.
We have time for one more.
Hi, my name is Bill. This is a question about what happened in Wisconsin, because it happened all over. Going back to Walmart. It also happened right here in Suffolk County, where Walmart was, they weren't paying their people enough, they were going on welfare, and subsequently, it was decided that you got to pay your people enough so that they don't have to go on welfare. That's actually what happened. But what happened in Wisconsin? Did these people lose their insurance? What was the rest of the fallout of them being made part-time?
So I actually kind of conflated two different stories. One of them was my initial reporting in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, where deindustrialization has led to basically the decimation of Black wealth there. But I also went to a suburb of Chicago called Joliet. And it was just in March where Walmart fired a bunch of workers there. And they're kind of dealing with a lot of different things. Some people have like gone on to work temporarily, I went to an organizing meeting where there are a number of men who they were actually traumatized because some of them had been working there for like maybe 5, 10, 15 years. They had a steady job. These were, mostly Black men in a random city called Joliet in Chicago. And some of them are doing, a part of the gig economy. Some folks just lost everything. So it varies, and it's an ongoing legal dispute right now, which is what I'm covering to see kind of what the outcome is going to be of that. So if there are no other questions, and we're actually a little bit past time, then that's it for this panel. Please give our main panel